Now I'd like to yield to one of the most informed congressmen on the issue of climate change, the Honorable John Linder of the great state of Georgia.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I first got interested in this 5 or 6 years ago on a trip to New Zealand. It was a congressional delegation. We had a visit with the leader of the NOAA point there where they leave to go into Antarctica for their expeditions and come back to this scientific center. And he put a PowerPoint presentation together for us on a big chart on the wall that showed that at that time they had dug into the Vostok ice core for 400,000 years back, and that from 400,000 years back to today, temperature increases and decreases and CO2 increases and decreases were in consonance. They moved with each other. And I asked him, who was burning fossil fuels 400,000 years ago? He took that as a rude question, and it took me a year to get a copy of that chart. But I studied that chart, and then I looked at the studies about the Vostok ice core. And what you discover when you don't have it on a very 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and expand it is that temperature changes precede CO2 changes by about 1,000 years.
Now, what does that mean? That means that temperature is the dominant variable, and then it drives the dependent variable, which is CO2.
That's correct.
Temperature goes up, and then CO2 goes up.
One study says 800 years, one study says 2,800 years, but people average it at about 1,000 years.
So Vice President Gore is only off by 180 degrees.
That's about right.
Yeah.
That's about right. And so is the entire IPCC report. CO2 is a trace gas. It is a plant food. It is beneficial to all of life. CO2 is a modest gas. Methane is 23 times more powerful at trapping heat. 65% of the heat-trapping gases come from water vapor. We're not going after them because we're going after people. What you learn when you discover that CO2 temperatures follow the temperature changes is that there's a reason for it. And the reason is this: we go through ice ages and global increases and declines in temperature. And as the temperature declines globally, the trees at the top of the mountain start to die for lack of photosynthesis, and then the bushes and then the grasslands. And the dust that blows in the winds that are always here blows out across the oceans, and part of that dust is lead. And when that lead settles to the bottom of the oceans, it catalyzes growth in the largest biological mass we have on this planet, the plankton. And that growth demands CO2 to keep it going. Now, the oceans contain 70 times as much of CO2 as the atmosphere does. And as the plant life, the plankton, pull that CO2 out of the oceans, homeostasis, or equilibrium, causes more CO2 to come out of the atmosphere and into the oceans. The reverse happens when the planet warms up. So colder oceans hold more CO2 than warm oceans, and when the planet cools off, the CO2 winds up in the oceans and out of the atmosphere. We have 388 parts per million today.
And we believe in the Atlantic and the Pacific we're in a cooling period. Isn't that?
They have been in a cooling period.
Something called a PSO and a AMO or something.
That's correct. They have been in a cooling period. And we have now 3,400 instruments that go into the oceans. And every 10 days they pop up and they give the satellites information about what's on those instruments about the temperatures, and there's been no warming in the ocean.
I know that it's dangerous for congressmen to actually think. You know, we're not accused of doing that very often, but there are sometimes some congressmen, you and I think are too, not that others don't, but we actually think. Now, I want to build on what you just said. These ice core samples that you got the data that show temperature goes up and then CO2 goes up. And if temperature were to go down, then CO2 would go down.
That's correct.
Now, in the last decade...
Well, as temperatures go down, CO2 in the atmosphere goes up.
Okay, so we're in a situation where...
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right.
We're in a situation right now where it appears, depends on the data that you believe, but if the data points that we think are correct, we're in a cooling period. Temperature's gone down at least 8 years in a row and probably 12 years in a row, and we appear to be in a cooling period. But at the same time, we have to admit that CO2 concentrations are going up.
That's correct.
So I would hypothesize that the CO2 concentrations going up are going to prevent as much cooling, and it will keep the planet warmer than it would be otherwise, but still cooler overall, which would be a good thing for mankind. We don't want another ice age, do we?
We do not. In the last
Now, that's just my hypothesis.
In the last 2 million years, we've had 20 ice ages, 20 glaciations. The last, on average, about 100,000 years, interrupted by about 10,000 years of warming. It's been 11,400 years since the last glaciation. It is likely that the planet is looking toward going cooler again. We've had less sun activity in the last 11 years than we've had in many, many years.
Again, I'm told this, you probably know, I don't, that there are more glaciers in the world that are growing than there are that are declining.
Than are receding, that's correct. But 388 parts per million is not even high. It's at the low end of the comfort scale. Roughly 65 to 135 million years ago, when the dinosaurs roamed this earth, CO2 levels were 5 and 10 times as high as they are today, and produced a tremendous amount of greenery that fed those those animals. 542 million years ago was the Cambrian period. It came to be known as the Cambrian explosion because in a very short period of time, 5 to 10 million years, which in a 4.5 billion-year-old planet is a blink of an eye, in that short period of time, all of multicellular complex life that has ever existed on this earth was deposited in the fossil evidence. How did that happen? That happened because the temperatures were warmer, the CO2 levels were 7,000 parts per million, 20 times what it is today. The entire planet was covered with greenery and had immense amounts of oxygen. And all of complex life as we know it, 96% of which is no longer existent.
But it would have been a little warmer than it is today.
It's a little warmer.
We might not have been comfortable wearing a woolen sweater back then.
But it would have been better than a glaciation.
That's very true.
We are told that this temperature is growing too. I always like to ask people who tell me this temperature is growing too much to say, what should the correct temperature be? Tell me. Should it be the temperature 1,000 years ago when Greenland was settled for agriculture? Or when the people in Scotland were growing wine grapes? Or should it be 879 AD when the Thames froze over? Or should it be the Little Ice Age when Greenland was emptied of life again? Because
all I know is when people retire, they move to Florida and
They don't
Texas.
move to Greenland.
Yeah, they don't move to Iceland or Greenland.
CO2 is a beneficial, trace, helpful gas that feeds plants. And this whole notion that we should control it somehow is nothing but vanity. We are not going to change what's put on this planet for 4.5 billion years. Now we're told, and we heard from a gentleman from Massachusetts, that there is a scientific consensus. He said 98% of the scientists, tens of thousands, agree with his position. Well, I would like to ask him to produce that list, because only 600 of them shared the Nobel Prize with Al Gore. A scientist from Australia has said only 35 people actually wrote the IPCC reports, and they're controlled by 10 people. But what is not popularly known...
One of whom was just resigned from his position in East Anglia.
He did. What is not popularly known is that 32,000 scientists, including Edward Teller, 9,000 of whom are PhDs and the rest masters, have signed a statement that said there is no evidence that humans are causing any impact on the global warming that occurred between 1975 and 1998. None whatsoever. In fact, 5 scientists who contributed to the first IPCC report, said in their papers there is no evidence that humans are contributing. Those 5 statements were removed by the top bureaucrat at the IPCC and replaced with one statement that said there is no doubt that humans are causing this. He was asked about that under oath in a legal action. Why did he remove those statements? He said, under immense pressure from the top of the federal government of the United States. Now, consensus doesn't mean much in science. Consensus is important in politics. In science, we ought to be seeking truth and fact. And indeed, in science, only two conditions ever obtain. One is theory, and the other is fact. You put forth your theory, you release your underlying documents and sources and methods, and you let your peers review it and try and replicate it. That is the point at which I got very nervous about this science, because I tried to get underlying documents from Jim Henson, who had the first computer model, first testified before Congress in 1989, I believe, in the Senate. Recently spoke in England and said we have 4 years to save the planet. He doesn't release his source documents because he said they're proprietary. Well, he's an employee of the federal government. The federal government ought to own those documents. They ought to be released. And when somebody is hiding something, when somebody's hiding things, you begin to wonder why they're hiding it.
It'd be similar to if we held an election and we just said, assume that I won.
That's right.
But we didn't release the source documents, we didn't release the ballots, we didn't let them be audited, we didn't have a canvassing committee. We just said, we'll assume that since Congressman Linder says he won, he did win.
And what we're learning from the East Anglia, I want to make a point that the gentleman...
And then we want to go to Mr. Scalise.
I want to make a point that those are not stolen documents. Those documents were released from inside by a whistleblower.
Well, they should be in the public domain anyway.
Of course.
Because almost all of them.
But somebody working inside that organization realized they were destroying documents that were being asked for under the Freedom of Information Act and released those documents. I believe that we ought to be thinking about releasing everything, let scientists pore over it, and establish whether the theory is actually a fact and move on.
I agree. We want to now turn to the congressman from New Orleans, Louisiana, a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Congressman Scalise.
I want to thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding and the gentleman from Georgia for opening up this discussion. And of course, what we're talking about and the reason why this is so important is that the world, many of the different world leaders are getting ready to meet in Copenhagen, Denmark, to start discussing a Kyoto II type treaty, a treaty for many countries, including the United States, to literally change the way our entire manufacturing base operates. And of course, here in Congress, we've been debating the proposal by Speaker Pelosi and others to codify that type of treaty in the form of the cap-and-trade national energy tax. They're trying to bring a national energy tax to our country to tax businesses, to tax not only businesses, but also individuals in their household electricity use, fossil fuels. And it's all in the name of stopping man-made global warming. And so, of course, what brings us to this debate that you're focusing on is the fact that we have found out recently through ClimateGate that the science that they're using is corrupt. The scientists, in fact, behind much of the data that's been used to try to sell a cap-and-trade energy tax, that's been used to try to sell the Kyoto Treaty, and now this new meeting in Copenhagen to have a Kyoto II type agreement, all of it was based on corrupted data. And of course, you go back to former Vice President Al Gore, who said, the debate is over, trying to imply that all the scientists are in agreement. And of course, as my colleague from Georgia pointed out, the scientists are not in agreement. But what's even worse is now we found out and uncovered this scandal where some of the scientists who have been collecting data through the UN's International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, who is the respected body worldwide on all this data, it turns out as the clearinghouse, they were actually corrupting the data that's being used. In some of the examples through these emails, Phil Jones, who just resigned, said, I've just completed Mike's nature trick to, and he goes on and he talks about to hide the decline in temperatures. And we go back to the infamous hockey stick graph that Al Gore used in his film Inconvenient Truth. And I guess the most recent inconvenient truth for the former vice president is that these emails have now come out and exposed the scandal. And I just want to, the gentleman from Texas will allow me, I want to read a few other of the emails, and I know my colleague from Illinois just earlier highlighted some of the other emails, but just to show how deep this is. First, Phil Jones, in an email last year, said, Mike, can you delete any emails you may have had with Keith regarding AR4 dataset? Keith will do likewise. And he says, can you also email Gene and get him to do the same? I don't have his email address. We will be getting Casper to do likewise. So here he's talking about deleting data, deleting the emails that show that some of this manipulation and corruption of the data was going on. And this is the person who is the director of the University of East Anglia's Climatic Research Unit, a scientist who should not only understand the importance of following the facts, following the data, but also understands that as others try to verify this data, that's something that he should be open and freely willing to share.
This AR4 data set is the data set that was used in the IPCC report in 2007. So it's a seminal document that has been used for policy-making decisions, not just in the United States, but all over the world.
Exactly.
And what you're saying is they went to some lengths to manipulate the data that report's based on.
They went to lengths to manipulate the data, and then, of course, they went to lengths to actually delete, to hide it, to try to destroy the evidence, in essence. And, of course, some of that data, as you know, as the ranking member of Energy and Commerce, when we were having that debate here in committee and on the House floor on the cap-and-trade energy tax, many of the people who are promoting that national energy tax, Speaker Pelosi and her liberal lieutenants and others, are using that IPCC data to say, look, we need to act quickly because the data shows. And of course, now we know that the data was corrupted. But then he goes on, and we were all familiar in this country with the freedom of information. This administration came in saying that they were going to be the most transparent administration ever. And yet you look at these emails further, and he says, this is in an email, the freedom of information line we're all using is this. So he's telling some of his other scientists who were involved in this corruption, he says, IPCC is exempt from any country's Freedom of Information Act. The skeptics have been told this. Even though we possibly hold relevant info, the IPCC is not part, and then he goes on to say, therefore, we don't have an obligation to pass it on. So he's trying to lay out this groundwork so that he doesn't even have to turn over his data. This is, I think, before he destroyed it. And then he says, if the Royal Meteorological Society is going to require authors to make all data available, raw data plus results from all intermediate calculations, he says, I will not submit any further papers to the RMS Journal. This is Phil Jones again, leading scientist whose data is used by many of these people all throughout the world to try to pass Kyoto-type agreements in the cap-and-trade energy to be debated over in the Senate. And I'd yield, yes.
Sadly, that data that the IPCC uses from East Anglia is also the basis of the data that NASA uses in Huntsville, Alabama, and all the other future models that have been built have been somehow shaped by that data, so there's no place to go now, since all of the documents, source documents, have been thrown away, to reconstruct all that.
And it's really frustrating because there are scientists who have a different opinion, who have tried to present alternative data to this corrupt scientific data, and they've been blacklisted. And in fact, I won't go into detail on those here, but that information will continue to come out. But in some of the emails, they actually go on to describe how they are going to try to blacklist other scientists who tried to propose data that shows something different than theirs. And in fact, even saying that they're going to withhold some of their journal writings so that they won't even publish some of this information. And so I go on to say this because they're trying to use this corrupt data, this corrupt scientific data, to pass not only a cap-and-trade energy tax that will run millions of jobs out of this country, but they're also trying to use it now in conjunction with the EPA, with their latest ruling, to try to literally threaten Congress by saying, okay, well, if you don't pass cap-and-trade here in Congress, then the EPA will, in a de facto way, try to pass their own cap-and-trade using these radical environmentalists in the EPA, just using the corrupt scientific data to try to pass it, even if Congress won't pass it, because the American people have realized this will run millions of jobs out of our country. Many groups, the National Association of Manufacturers, on the low end says We would lose 3 million jobs in our country if cap-and-trade energy tax would pass, and every American family would pay over $1,000 more per year in higher electricity rates. And all of this is based upon false scientific data that's been corrupted, and we know it from the ClimateGate emails.
Could I ask the chair how much time we have remaining in our special order?
There are 12 minutes remaining.
12 minutes, okay. I'm going to have to ask that with about 10 minutes to go, I regain the, because I've got some documents I want to put in the record.
I want to just make one point. I want to make one point. The data that you're talking about that we're acting on in this country with cap and trade is also the data being used in Copenhagen today, as we speak, to begin what Al Gore called the ultimate reason for all of this, global governance, turning over the sovereignty of the United States to an unelected bureaucracy in the United Nations.
I want to thank Congressman Scalise, Congressman Linder, and Congressman Shimkus for participating in this special order. What we're attempting to do is actually use the scientific method to determine what steps, if any, the United States government should take policy-wise if, in fact, climate change or global warming is a major problem that needs to be addressed. And it does appear, in my opinion, that there is reasonable doubt about whether we should take some of the radical steps that have been espoused in the climate change bills that passed the House and are pending in the Senate. I want to take the remaining time and go through a series of emails that have just become public. We've alluded to them and go into a little more depth. The first email, which we've already alluded to, is from Michael Mann. Michael Mann is a climatologist at Penn State University. He's one of the leading scientists in the IPCC. He is the author of the original hockey stick theory that is kind of the genesis, the seminal document for the theory that man-made CO2 is the cause of the climate warming in the world. This is a document from him to Phil Jones, who is, until recently, the head of the climate research unit at East Anglia University in Great Britain. Now, Dr. Jones has resigned in the last week or so, but in it says, can you delete any emails that you've had with Keith? Keith is Keith Briffia, B-R-I-F-F-A, regarding AR4. AR4 is a UN IPCC fourth assessment document from 2007 that's one of these policy documents that's used around the world. And you can see that he says, I'm going to contact Gene about this. Okay, Gene is actually Eugene Wall, W-A-H-L. He's at the National Ocean and Atmospheric in Colorado. That's with the U.S. Department of Commerce. So I'm going to contact Gene about this. And then can you delete any emails that you have? I'll get Casper to do likewise. Casper is Casper Jones. He is, Castor Ammann, A-M-M-A-N-N. He's at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR, in Boulder, Colorado. It's a federally supported consortium. So in this email, we have collaboration between NOAA, NCAR, both in the United States, the Climate Research Unit, CRU, in East Anglia, Great Britain, and many prominent IPCC contributors coordinating document destruction. I think that is something that policymakers here in the United States should be concerned about. Now let's go to the next document, slide email number 2. Now the first one was from Michael Mann to Phil Jones. This is from Phil Jones to a gentleman named Tom Wigley, and its subject is SCHLE, Schlee's Suggestion. This is last year, December of 2008. It says, I am supposed to go through my emails, and he can get anything I've written about him. About 2 months ago, I deleted loads of emails, so we have very little, if anything, at all. So what this is showing is that they have, one could say they have conspired to delete data. This Ben Santer, who is Santer 1, is a prominent climate modeler at the Department of Energy's Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and Tom Wigley is a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. The gist of this is he's already deleted a lot of emails from 2 months ago. Now, what are they trying to hide here? Now, let's go to email number 3. Email number 3 shows an unprecedented data purge at the CRU in East Anglia, Great Britain. Here is a public index of documents on one day, and then here is the public index on the next, very quickly after they've gone through and purged all of this. It says the next day, on July the 28th, Phil Jones deleted data from his public files, leaving online a variety of files from the 1990s. This morning, everything in Dr. Phil's directory had been removed. It's not just the emails that have been deleted. In a widely reported event, Steve McIntyre, who's a Canadian researcher who testified before Congress several years ago when I was chairman, and who has been attempting to get these data sets, to get these documents, he's been trying to get, through Freedom of Information Act, the documents that some of these studies are purported to be based upon. And instead of releasing them, they purged them. They took them away in what is reported to be an unprecedented data purge. They've deleted files pertaining to station data from the public directories. Why? Where are the data now, if they're still in existence? What is it they're trying to hide? If the temperature data records really prove their theory, they would want to publicize them. At least I would think that they would. Okay, let's go to number 4. This is an email from Phil Jones, who we know well now, to a gentleman named Neville Nichols. Mr. Nichols, see, Mr. Nichols, I'm not sure who Mr. Nichols is, but here it says, I hope I don't get a call from Congress. Okay? I'm hoping that no one there realizes I have a U.S. Department of Energy grant and have had this with Tom W. for the past 25 years. So this is back in 2005. This is when I was chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we were conducting the investigation of the hockey stick proposal, hockey stick theory, and we had asked for some documents from Professor Mann or Dr. Mann, and this gentleman is saying we hope the Congress doesn't realize that we're getting federal money. We don't want them to be asking us about documents. Of course, as we now know, they have destroyed many of those documents, or apparently have destroyed many of those documents. Okay, let's go to number 5. Now, this document shows that the links to which they'll go to suppress information. It says, if they ever hear that there is a Freedom of Information Act now in the UK, I think I'll delete these rather than send them to anyone. Now, Congressman Markey, who's a good friend of mine and is a believer, a proponent of man-made global warming, has got data sets that he says justify some of the policies that he supports. But here we see that some of these documents and some of these data sets that Mr. Markey and others who sincerely believe that there's a problem appear to be very suspect. In fact, they're so suspect that if they have to release them publicly, they would rather delete them than to comply with the Freedom of Information Act. Tom Wigley has sent me a worried email when he heard about it. He thought that people might ask him for his model code. My heavens. You know, keep in mind that this theory that mankind made CO2 emissions is driving the temperature upwards. It's just that. It's a theory. And these researchers have built these models to try to replicate the planet's temperature mechanism, and all these models show the temperature going up. But that's the conclusion that the modelers want. It is not factually correct to say the temperature is going up. It's factually correct to say the modelers who want to prove that the temperature is going up are putting variables and assumptions in these models that drive them up, but they apparently don't have the data to back that up. Okay, let's go to number 6. This is again from Mr. Jones to a gentleman named Gavin Schmidt concerning the revised version of something called the WenGen paper, W-E-N-G-E-N. It says, all of our Freedom of Information officers have been in discussions and are now using the same exceptions not to respond, the advice that they got from the Information Commissioner. The Freedom of Information line that we're using is that the IPCC, now keep in mind the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is funded primarily by the U.S. taxpayer, not exclusively, but primarily, is exempt from any country's freedom of information, because the skeptics have been told this. Even though we possibly hold relevant information that the IPCC is not part of our remit, i.e. mission statement, therefore we don't have an obligation to pass it on. Now, to me, that's just irresponsible to say that the IPCC, which is a total governmental agency, admittedly through the UNN and a large number of nations, but the U.S. is the primary funder, is above federal freedom of information laws, not only in the United States, but every other country. This information that's been collected and paid for by U.S. taxpayers and funded by U.S. scientists is now out of reach of the U.S. taxpayer. I think that's just flat wrong, Madam Speaker. And my last email is number 7. And this shows, while they accuse people like myself of trying to be bullies and to ostracize people, here's an email where, again, this Professor Mann, it's to Michael Mann from a gentleman named Malcolm Hughes. Just a heads up, apparently the contrarians now have an N with GRL. And GRL, which is the Geophysical Research Letters, which is a prominent climate journal. This guy, Sayers, has a prior connection with the University of Virginia Department of Environmental Sciences that causes me some unease. And then later on, this is truly awful. If you think that Sayers is in the greenhouse skeptics camp, then if we can find documentary evidence of this, we could do channels to get him ousted. They're trying to ostracize those that are honest enough to say that they have some doubts about the theory. And I'll end with this. The theory of global warming caused by mankind is just that. It is a theory. It is not a fact. As U.S. taxpayers and as the guardians of the U.S. taxpayers, we should demand that the facts be made public so that we can make a relevant policy decision. I thank the gentleman.